Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on adding Swagger to your existing APIs. We'll be talking about how you can automate a code-first approach using some of the different Swagger tools. My name is Ryan. I'm here joined with Nathan, and we're going to be walking you through some different examples of how you can use both open source and some of our free tools for actually adding Swagger to your existing APIs and generating open API definitions for your APIs. I'll be passing off to Nathan in just a second, but I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be sharing a recording of today's webinar. We'll be sending out the recording hopefully by tomorrow. That way you can get that in your inbox as well as a copy of today's slides. And we'll also be keeping an eye on questions throughout the webinar. So if you do have questions, we recommend that you use the Q&A box in the Zoom portal there. Post your questions there. We'll try to answer them as they come in. And we will be trying to save as much time as we can at the end of today's session to have a little bit more of a discussion around some of these topics, answer some of your questions, and try to get through as much as we can later on in the second half of today's session. So at this time, I'm going to pass off to Nathan. As I said, we will be on the line answering questions, so feel free to put them in the Q&A box as we go along.
Perfect. Thanks, Ryan. Once again, my name is Nathan Wright. I'm the product marketing manager here for Swagger and Swagger Hub Tools. As Ryan mentioned, we'll be taking a look at a couple of different approaches for implementing kind of a code-first strategy when we're generating APIs or building APIs. There's a couple of things that we'll kind of talk about before we get into that. Essentially, the difference really between like a design-first approach and a code-first approach. We typically talk about the design-first one, but there's a lot of value in potentially using them kind of collaboratively or concurrently. We'll do a quick demo, essentially, at a very high level. I've got a kind of a basic API that we're kind of compiling and building. And as part of that, it spits out a Swagger specification. So we're using the Maven plugin for that. And we'll get into this in more detail later. But we'll look at some of the functionality there as well as some of the other plugins that we support to essentially move things away from the API itself and into like an external repository system. Before we get too far along here, just want to mention we are here at SmartBear. We build a number of different tools. Obviously, today we're talking about Swagger Hub and Swagger tool sets. Those are just part of the full story here. So as many of you may know, the Swagger kind of component is open source, and it's very similar to what we support with SoapUI for API testing. On top of a lot of these open source projects that we support, we have kind of professional grade versions. And really they're designed to solve a lot of problems that people run into when using some of those open source projects at scale. We'll talk more about that later. But yeah, just at a very high level here at SmartBear, we have a pretty robust workflow or tool set. One of the big things is being able to reuse assets from one piece to the next. So down at the bottom left there, we have Swagger and Swagger Hub. That's where we'll spend the bulk of our time today. But the key thing, and obviously the thing that we're going to be talking about the most, is that specification. Now, what's kind of interesting about the other tools in that bottom line is that we can take that spec and essentially create API functional tests very, very quickly, essentially import the specification. It tells us what requests look like. It tells us what our responses look like. So pretty much everything we need for kind of a straightforward test is going to be built out. And then we can use those components and those pieces to build functional test flows. So there's some pretty cool stuff we can do there. And then that functional test, that little script, we can move over into something like LoadUI Pro, run it at scale. We can use it as essentially like a passive monitor with alert site. So we can have it just running and running and running and letting us know whenever something kind of falls outside of an SLA or whenever anything starts failing. And we also support virtualization. So this is one of the ones that I always like to talk about, but I don't think we'll have time to really get into today. Essentially, we have that specification, that OAS file. We can actually stand up a mock service very, very quickly off the back of a tool like Service V. Again, just like the testing piece, it includes the request, includes the response. So we can very easily use that to kind of generate a virtualized instance of the API without writing really any code. So it's pretty cool. For today's session, we're going to do a little bit of kind of a discussion around code first, design first, just kind of make sure everyone's on the same page before we jump into the demo. Got a demo. It's pretty straightforward. Just kind of walking through some of the functionality or best practices, whatever we want to kind of position that as. I think this morning it took about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A as well. The goal there, we're not necessarily going to troubleshoot issues with kind of annotation libraries or anything like that. More just kind of the option to discuss some of the workflow capabilities at a high level. That being said, we will be kind of making a note of frequently asked questions. So if there's any specific languages or anything like that you'd like to see some more information on, we will be following up with like a FAQ blog post, just stuff that came in from this morning and this afternoon session, and then we can kind of present it in a single document for everybody to read through. That's where we'll kind of position to post most of the documentation and specifics about certain languages, that type of thing. Cool. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. Code first versus design first. Now, before we take a look at either of those, let's just talk a little bit about the traditional, quote unquote, traditional software development lifecycle. Generally, we will start with a plan. I don't think I've seen any kind of project where we just start writing code without having an idea of why we were going to be building that application, why we're building the API. We should have an idea of who will be consuming and using this service, like who are we building it for, and then what is it going to serve? What is its scope? What is its purpose? What is it doing? Really, why are we going to be spending time and resources? How do we justify spending time and resources building something like that? Typically, we'll get a sign off on the plan. We'll then start to write our code. We'll test or verify that code either through like a unit test or a unit test set or functional testing. And finally, we'll do something like stage it. Now, traditionally, this is exactly where we'd start to pull in feedback, right? We'd have a working version. It might be like a slice of the full kind of thing, or there might be some dummy data behind it, but it will, respond to our requests in a certain way. And this is typically the stage that we're going to get feedback on that initial plan, on that build that we spent weeks, months kind of putting out there. The issue here is that there's a pretty sizable feedback loop where, the difference between when I wrote or coded the API and when it's staged and deployed and, my API consumers, my third parties, my stakeholders, they're actually giving me feedback. I could be on to the next project. I could be working in the next sprint. I could have totally forgotten, what it was I was doing in the first place on that initial API. So really the goal here that we're talking about is shrinking that loop distance and closing the gap between when we're writing code and when we're getting feedback on that. Now, we talk a lot here about design first. We see it as a really neat way to start to develop software. Essentially, we plan just like we did before at a very high level. We generate, instead of just a loose, email chain or like a couple of meetings that we kind of come together and come up with that plan. We actually design. We map that to something like a specification. That design we can now get feedback on. This could be through standing up a virtualized instance. It could be through presenting something like, end consumer documentation. We could hand over that, OAS file and get feedback directly on that. But really the goal is that we, have that design. It's acting as a contract of what the API is going to do, what request and response it's going to kind of serve. And we can start to expose that to our consumers. Again, it's much easier to make changes to that design. It's much easier to change a YAML file than to restructure and compile and deploy an entire application. Obviously, this is fine if we have no API to start with. If we have the plan and we have the flexibility or the time to come up with that design, this is great. But today we're talking about code first, which implies that we have already an API. That doesn't mean that we can't leverage things like the specification and that we can't leverage things like that shorter feedback loop. A lot of people that I've spoken to when we get into this code first approach typically use this to generate documentation, essentially a way to tie the end user docs or the API docs to the actual code, make sure everything's in line, everything's current, etc. But really what we want to talk about today and what we're going to kind of hone in on is that feedback piece. How do we generate this file? How do we put it somewhere useful that it can be consumed? And then how do we get feedback against that? If we put it somewhere smart, if we're intelligent with what we do with that file, then we can hand it off to something like a testing group so that, again, in parallel, we can be getting our feedback, building new tests, updating the application until we have something that fits the bill and we can stage and finally deploy. So we'll talk a little bit about some different things here as we go through the day. Annotation libraries. This is really how we update our kind of code, our source code, so that some of these plugins and some of these tools actually understand where is the API, what is the API, what functions does it serve. Really, those annotations are kind of the linchpin of a lot of what gets generated with Swagger. Again, we won't get too far into like the specific ones. You know, we won't be comparing like a Node.js annotation library to like a Java one, or I don't know, Swashbuckle to Swagger Core or anything like that. Really, the goal is just to understand that we need one of those annotation libraries. If we build in a certain framework, I think if we have like a Rails app or something that we can quickly kind of pull just because it comes in a very standard format, or it's built in a standard format. But with some of these other kind of ways of designing and building these applications, we do need to leverage one of those annotation libraries. What we'll really focus on is the plugin piece. I've got Maven that will do most of the work for me locally, but here we have built kind of equivalent functionality for the Gradle piece as well. But we're going to use these build plugins to essentially define what action is performed when we execute it. When we generate that file as part of the build, like what do we do with it? We show it in the browser? Do we post it out somewhere? That's really what we're going to talk about today. And finally, that Swagger Hub plugin. We're going to talk about Swagger Hub. It's, in my mind, a very useful place for storing open API specifications. It acts as essentially a single source of truth, a central repository for all of our different teams and APIs and versions and all the different things that we're generating as part of these build processes. And really, it's a great place to start to get that feedback, and we'll see some of that in a little bit. But I think the even beyond that, versioning is very useful. Exposing documentation, very useful. You know, traditionally the docs are tied to the server in a lot of cases, and what we can see here is that we can kind of move that responsibility to another application, to another platform, by generating, pushing to something like Swagger Hub. And so before we dive much further into this, the things that we really want to kind of think of as best practices when we're utilizing this code-first approach is that we still want to get feedback as early as possible. Obviously, we'll probably have written our code by the time that we send it out to get feedback, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't influence the next version or the upcoming changes. Really, we want to mitigate the cost of integrating with an API. So I want to be able to give my feedback. I need X and Y. Before I can build my integration, and the development team on the other side can say, hey, yep, we can do that right now. Build that out and push a change, and again, continue that shortened feedback loop. Alerting users to upcoming changes. You know, when we're coding actively, very frequently, and we're pushing out changes and versions and that type of thing, we really need to know and understand what's going to change, and we need to present that to our consumers. When we can prepare consumers for things like breaking changes, things are going to go a lot smoother. We end up like supporting less issues on the other side. And really what we'll see is that we can maintain a version, like a default current production level version. And if we're generating these open API specifications as we're building our application, we can start to map out, okay, you know, a week from now when we push this to prod, what is the functionality going to be? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months? However far we've kind of coded ahead of time, and we've, you know, handed this off to testing groups or whatever, we have that documentation, we have that specification ready to go. We have it stored and presented to our users so they can see, again, what those upcoming changes are looking like, and even give feedback on that. You know, there's a certain kind of gap between when we'd want to, you know, push something out and start to get feedback. Finally, we'll talk about the advantages of a platform solution, essentially ways that we can standardize workflows, processes, how it can sit in the center of a lot of these different kind of development life cycles, kind of like the diagram on the right. We have the development team up at the top, pushing things down. There's a centralized system there, a platform that everybody else can link up to. That could be something like GitHub, you know, Bitbucket, GitLab, whatever it might be, or it could be a dedicated platform or dedicated application like Swagger Hub. Great, so I do want to dive into the demo here, jump right in and then leave plenty of time for questions. Ryan, I saw you pull the microphone down. You have something you want to bring up or questions or something like that?
Yeah, Thanks so much, everyone. We just wanted to, I thought it'd be a good chance before jumping to the demo. I know we talked a lot about the design first and code first approaches. And so I thought it'd be good just to say, I'll launch a quick poll in here, just to see kind of where people are at, I think to level set, to get a better understanding of where people are at in terms of, are people already following this code first approach? Maybe they already have annotation libraries that they're using, or maybe they're embracing more of a design first approach. Love to get it. Yeah, thanks to everyone who's starting to fill these out.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. It's, we see a lot of people want to get into the design first kind of piece, but they feel like, oh, we need a new API, or we need to shift towards microservices in order to even think about doing something like sitting down and mapping out our entire API kind of structure. But I do think that they potentially go hand in hand, and it's really cool to see the feedback coming in of how people are utilizing this.
Yeah, and I know a lot of the folks on the line won't see the results that are coming in live, but what we're seeing a lot is a lot of people who are saying they're using both design and code first approaches. Excuse me, a lot of people who are using code first approach but are looking to move to a design first approach in the future, which we certainly see a lot of as well.
Yeah, definitely across the industry, we're seeing this kind of shift towards the design first stuff. And as we kind of mentioned, I think when we look at it from a high level, some of the advantages that we can leverage, or some of the advantages that we can kind of see, things like early feedback, things like staging, and preparing other teams like our ops teams for the upcoming kind of application service, or preparing a gateway to support something that's going to be coded or tested. There's a lot of ways that we can leverage that design when we think about the rest of the life cycle.
Absolutely. And so the rest of the demo we're going to be going through, folks, we'll be kind of diving in and showing some of the ways that if you're working this kind of more code first approach, you have existing APIs, how you'd work with those. But if there is additional information to learn a little bit more about starting to adopt design first approach, we certainly have plenty of resources. It's something we talk a lot about. We've done plenty of webinars and trainings on, so we can certainly share those as well. But Nathan, I'll let you jump back in. Just thought we'd get a measure of the audience here.
Yeah. And again, I appreciate the feedback on these polls. It really does give us a good idea of what people are interested in, and what we can do kind of going forward. Awesome. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the demo here. Let's just minimize the slides. I can't do this without making a big mess. There we go. All right, so what do we have on the screen? When we jump into my IDE here, essentially we've got a pretty straightforward application or API that I've kind of built out, or to be honest, I pulled down from an example repository. What's happening here is I've already taken the time to kind of build out the Swagger Maven plugin. And what this is doing, it's going to kind of read through my library, my kind of application. It's going to look for certain kind of values, annotations, and it's going to map those to an eventual Swagger file. This means that when I go ahead and compile this, I'm going to be left with a JSON file. We can see it tucked in the structure of the application up in the top left there, the swagger.json, and it's also going to give me, in this case, an HTML document. This is essentially for me to just go ahead and we'll just refresh this here. Get some very loose documentation, some very high-level documentation out of this application. And again, this is all tied back to annotations that exist in the code. A good example of what's going on here, when we look at this post method, we can see that we've got some descriptions, we've got our kind of security piece, we've got some information about our requests, but here in the response section, we're only ever going to give back, by design, a 405. That's great if we have an invalid input, but what happens when we actually successfully store something in the back end? We should be returning, what is it, a 201 or something like that? I know that the application is going to do that. I know that it's going to save something successfully, but it's not actually getting mapped to our documentation here. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the resource that defines that. In here, we can see that we've got some of these different annotations built out. I've got my API responses kind of object here, and we're just going to go ahead and let's add a new one in, again, for that 201. So we'll just say the code is 201, and the message, in this case, successfully stored submission. Great. So we can go ahead, save that. and nothing that we really have to update on this other side. Maybe we want to be a little more explicit in the title of this service. We'll call this Nathan's Pet Store API. Now, we're just going to rerun this. And if we refresh, once this completes that browser page, we should see that we now have that information included. So again, we're kind of tying the code that I've written and the build process that's going on to the eventual kind of output to this like artifact document that we're going to expose. Now, the nice thing here is that this HTML file isn't really tied to my service. There we go. We can see the 201 there. That's pretty clever. This isn't really tied to my service. Like I could take this HTML, pass it off to like my documentation team or my tech team, my tech writer team. They could flesh this out a little bit. Maybe I have a process like a Jenkins pipeline that picks up this file and pushes it into some repository that is supported through our kind of a web portal or something like that. The catch is that this is pretty static, right? This is an HTML file. There's not a lot of flourish. There's not a lot of stuff in here. And then when we look at using something like Swagger UI, even with the annotation piece, it's really tied to the application itself. So it's hard to kind of pull apart the UI, the docs component, and the kind of the API itself or the application itself. And in my experience, it's not very common that those really should be living on the same service or exposed through the same service in the same way. Maybe we use an API gateway to route, but in most cases, we want to separate those pieces of functionality out. So how can we do this? What can we do to kind of take this to the next step? We've annotated, we're generating this HTML file. It's all coming from this JSON kind of schema that's behind here. So that's really what we want to focus on. We want to move that JSON definition to an external resource. And we're going to do that using Swagger Hub. Essentially, it's a way for us to kind of store and collect together all these different versions and all these different definitions into a single place. And we do have a Maven plugin for that as well. So let's just go ahead and drop that right in here. Let's see if I can just increase this here. View, where is it? So yeah, just trying to increase the size of the text here. It's in view. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll just open this up in Notepad and take a look at doing that there. So why don't we just go ahead and grab this. All right. So the text that we're going to include here, or that we're going to drop in, we'll just type right out. Essentially, we've got this new plugin that we're going to utilize that's going to lean on Swagger Hub. What this is going to do is when we compile the application here, when we build this application, we're going to push this now to an external source. Essentially, we have to tell it where to look. And again, this is something that we've already defined in the previous plugin, where we're kind of collecting together all those annotations and generating that Swagger JSON file. And then the rest of this here, we're telling it where in the Swagger Hub instance to store this. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at that in the browser just to understand before we get too far along what's going on. On the left-hand side, we have a bunch of different what we call organizations. Typically, these are structured as teams or different lines of business or something like that. And then within these, we have different projects, and we see all the different APIs that kind of live under this organization. Now, within here, we already have an API for, let's say, our version 1 of the initial implementation of this pet store. I'm not sure why that took me there. Here we go. We're right now, let's say, working on version 2. We added that new response. We're building out some new functionality. We want to update what is already being consumed here by our API kind of users. So we can see that we have, again, this organization that's defined right up in the path. we have the API name, and then we have to decide on the version number. Now, this isn't a breaking change. This isn't anything dramatic. So let's just go ahead and change this to maybe 1.5.0. Again, we're telling it where that file lives, API name, organization, this token, nobody write that down. It's how we essentially authenticate this, but I will be changing that right after this webinar. And now I'm just going to drop that again into my POM file, save that, and I understand that the text is a little small, but I really just kind of copy pasted that in. And what we should see is when we rerun the Maven task, it's going to not only generate that file, it's going to generate that updated file, it's going to push this now to the external resource. What that means is that we're going to have this kind of location away from my API, away from my code, away from my source control, that is just hosting and supporting the documentation now. Now, let's go ahead, jump back in, refresh the page, and I think we called it 1.2.0 or 1.5.0. So from this drop-down, here we go, 1.5.0. We can see that upcoming version. Now, when we jump in here, hopefully on the right-hand side, we can see that post, and we have that 201 that we previously kind of created. So everything is pretty much exactly like we had it running locally through that static HTML file. It's just separated out now from the application itself. Some of the other cool things that we can support here, that feedback loop that we've been talking about, how do we now get some information on what users want or what they're expecting out of this. We can see on the left-hand panel, there's this little commenting function where we can say, hey, this isn't the right format or something like that. Leave a comment here. Someone will be able to jump in, kind of reply, give their own feedback. This is a really nice way, again, to go back and forth against the actual specification. And that's huge because it's not like a Slack channel. It's not like emails or a couple meetings that we might have. It's actually saying, like, right here in the service, in the application that you're designing, this is my feedback. This is what I think needs to be a little bit better. Now, we do have ways that we can then kind of take this, build it. Obviously, if we had a new response that we wanted to include, we could build that into our into the application, push this out again, either update the existing file or push it out to a new version, maybe 1.5.1. And again, just continue to iterate, get feedback, and kind of move the process along. So it's pretty clever. It's pretty cool. We also can resolve these comments and create this like traceability kind of component where, the conversation's over and someone signed off on this and we implemented the change. But maybe we want to go back in time down the line and see, who actually signed off on that? Whose bright idea was it to change this format, or whose terrible idea was it? That should all be stored, again, against the specification itself. We got some questions in the morning session as well about what we support when it comes to 3.0. And this is kind of a cool idea where we've got this plugin, maybe I've been using this code first approach. I've been using these two plugins. I've been generating a lot of 2.0 versions of the specification. And maybe we're utilizing some new gateway or some new doc portal or some new, API management solution or something that only supports or is really working best when it supports 3.0. Swagger Hub actually allows us to convert this in just a click of the mouse. So we've got the 2.0 that, again, we submitted here through the back end of the service, through that plugin as part of the build process. And now I can just jump right in here, convert this to 3, and it's updated the format. It's kind of mapped everything, and I could jump in here, and if I wanted to, add some new servers or something like that, leverage some of the functionality that's supported, again, by that 3.0 specification, I could do that right here. So this is really clever. And again, we have in the top left the ability to now move ahead, move back. We can define what we call a default version. So in my mind, this is something that's running in a production environment. And people could treat this as like a documentation platform where we can come and see the default. Again, we could see upcoming changes, upcoming versions. We could be, giving feedback, getting feedback on those upcoming versions. So there's a lot of potential for what we can do beyond this. One of the other things that we support here is the ability to tie this into a much larger workflow. So when we look at the integrations that we have within the platform, we've got a couple here for source repositories. These are what we support with 3.0 right now. We also support webhooks. If we roll back to the 2.0 version, we can get a bit better an idea of what we do have. There we go. So this is a little bit more of a robust list. Now, I understand, we have the application built, but maybe it's going through its testing process. Maybe it's going through, I don't know, some kind of staging environment, or we're waiting for the ops team to find time to deploy this to an actual host. And in that meantime, we could actually stand up a mock version of it. So other teams who wanted to build integrations or just make some queries against this and see what the data is going to return, we can actually do this with a click of the mouse as well. So some really powerful functionality there. We can trigger pushes to external gateways through this tool as well. So let's say that we update our application, our code. We have the plugin set up to push to Swagger Hub here. As part of that, we can then push that further along to something like an Amazon gateway, Apigee. We have a webhook here, so we had some internal process that we needed to be sending this onto as well. This can essentially act as kind of a router in the center of all that actions or that functionality. And finally, the one here, style validator. This is kind of an interesting one where the tool actually comes with a set of rules that are going to say, hey, this is compliant to our kind of expected style guidelines. Maybe I've been writing my application using camel case when the rest of the organization uses snake case. That's exactly the kind of thing that we potentially want to check through like an automated process. We don't have to have somebody sit here and read through and say, oh, every time one built a new path here, it's in snake case, that looks good. We can do that now as part of this automated kind of component. So it's really, really clever in what we can do. And the API behind this would actually kick back a different response depending on whether or not it passes the style validation rules. And we can see at a very high level where our style validation rules are being broken. So it's easy for us to jump again back into the code, make our changes, recompile, and then we would have an updated version here living in Swagger Hub. So again, it's just essentially like exposing a layer on top of the Swagger spec that we're generating on the fly, and just building some functionality and some workflows into that. The last one that I'll mention here, and this is something that we can do through a plugin as well, but I think is a little easier to communicate with the UI in Swagger Hub. The connection to a source repository or source code repository. So if we have something like GitHub Sync set up, I have a repository, a specific branch, and let's say that I want to provide client SDKs. We have the Swagger CodeGen kind of plugins and projects. So we could be generating these SDKs as part of that Maven process. But then we need to make sure that we have some kind of pipeline or something designed that's going to pick up that set of SDKs and migrate it to wherever the heck we want to store it. What we can actually do with the platform here is essentially set that trigger up through the UI. So we would go ahead, create our GitHub sync. We would pick our path and repository, probably a folder in there that's for client files. And then on the right-hand side, we can see that all of these client SDKs can essentially be generated on the fly. And this is a really clever thing because now we can start to build our server code, right? We can generate all of the API information through that annotation, and through the plugin, we can push it up to something like Swagger Hub. And then all of the client-facing stuff that we would traditionally have to then go in and update and change, that's going to be done for us. And again, we can do that through the UI here, like we just kind of walked through, or we have a plugin for Maven and Gradle that we can essentially do that as well. It's not going to, again, take care of like pushing it up to GitHub, but it is going to allow us to generate that and essentially store it in a specific location so it could be picked up and kind of written out to something else. So there's a lot of flexibility here. I guess that's really what we want to present. There's a lot of flexibility in how we start to use this. But there's definitely some tried and trusted like best practices for using these things. Getting feedback early and often, storing things regardless of what version or the smallest change that we made. We want to make sure that that is being stored somewhere so that we can always go back and see exactly how this thing has changed, how we've iterated on this API. I know that there's, really frustrating when you go from like a version 1 to a version 2. There's been a million updates in between, and maybe I want to use version 1.5. It's probably still running somewhere. We should have the ability to go and see that documentation and be able to pull that down. So that pretty much wraps it up for the demo component here. Hopefully it was a little insightful. Again, we will be providing some different, essentially like FAQs on where to find all this plugin information, all the different annotation libraries, all that type of stuff we're going to put into a blog post just so we don't spend the next 20 minutes talking about one that's only interesting to a small group of users. But yeah, I don't know if there's been any particular questions, Ryan, that we want to kind of field. We've got about 20 minutes left.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of questions that came in, and thank you for a great demo here. Thanks everyone for your engagement on this session. We really appreciate it. As we jump into questions here, I wanted to let everyone know that we will also be sharing an additional poll in the webinar here. And this one is actually more geared towards if you are interested in learning more about the Swagger Hub platform. We have a great team here that works dedicated on Swagger and the open source and our pro tools. And if you are interested in learning more about Swagger Hub, specifically the tool that Nathan's showing here, we're happy to help kind of coordinate a call, help you better understand how this tool can work for your team and fit into your workflow, both if you're using a design first approach, a code first approach, or really looking to migrate to one approach or the other. But let's jump into some of the questions. One that came up that I think you spoke to at a high level, but I thought it was interesting was, what are the advantages for someone who does, we're talking a lot about design first approach here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are the advantages for someone who would want to migrate to that approach? Are there advantages that really stand out why we advocate for that approach more than maybe a code first approach?
So yeah, I'll definitely answer the question. First and foremost, Larry, thank you so much for just posting that in the chat. You just saved me a bunch of headaches and mashing keys trying to figure out how to increase the size here. Why would someone want to migrate from like a code first to a design first? Essentially, I think it comes down to cost, right? I talk to a lot of organizations, especially large organizations where there's typically like a kind of a sign-off process. Dev teams will build their code, they'll fulfill what they interpret to be the plan that was originally given to them or the requirements that were originally given to them, and push it out to testing. Testing will verify that it matches. Eventually it'll get to that stage environment, and then someone will have to sign off and say, okay, this looks exactly like what we wanted, and let's push it out. Changes at that point, there's been a huge gap between that initial kind of creation of the API and when that sign-off process is going to happen. So for us to then go back and say, okay, the sprint after this next one, we're going to have to go back to that API and make those changes and pull that in. It's going to be another month before we actually implement those, or those actually reach that sign-off point again. I know this is kind of an exaggerated scale, but we can really trim that down a lot by having a much better design initially, and then using that to really say, does the API that was developed actually match this design? There's a bunch of different testing solutions. We have a great one with SOAP UI that will essentially validate that, right? We can bring that Swagger specification, we can bring that Open API specification into a tool, tells us what the requests we wanted are, tells us all the responses that we should have. Let's say that we have, in this case, an Open API specification that said the API should return a 201. I make a query, it doesn't return a 201, it's returning a 200. That's exactly the kind of thing that we'd want to validate. I might not even catch that in a sign-up process or in a testing process. Someone might say, hey, 200 is pretty good. We'll just move this along, when in actuality, by design, it should be a 201. So I think it comes down to cost. It comes down to speed in which we can iterate. And I also think it makes it much clearer, what the goal is of something. It's fine for us to have Slacks and emails and Word docs and wiki pages and all that kind of stuff, Jira tickets and that kind of thing, but there's always room for interpretation with that. And, from my experience, developers love to kind of present what they believe is best. And I'm, very much the same way. Like, I have an opinionated way to execute on something, but we should have a plan, right? There should be something a little more kind of structured that we can start to work against. I think it just increases everybody's kind of understanding of the goals, and just leads to a more efficient process. Cool.
Yeah. I believe I tried to answer this during the webinar, and I just thought it was an interesting question. I believe the answer is no right now, but I wonder if maybe you've heard about this at all. Someone was wondering, when we talked about the comments feature in the Swagger Hub,
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way for that to be converted into connect to a Jira task or anything that they're doing there?
So that's a cool question. We do have an API call on the back end. It's essentially like the name of the API. Let's see if I can pull this up here. The name of the API, and here we go. I think it's .collaboration or something like that, but there's a way for us to essentially get a list of the messages associated with an API spec or with a specific version of an API spec. That we could definitely push, or and more realistically, pull from the back end of Swagger Hub and push up to something like Jira. So there is definitely a way that we can do that. Whether or not we can automate that from the Swagger Hub side, not 100% sure. But yeah, there is a lot of potential in pulling down messages and kind of moving them away from Swagger Hub itself. I guess my concern will be the depth that we want. Depending on how many conversations we've had, or how many comments, or how many third parties we're kind of bringing in here, it might get a little unmanageable. But yeah, if you've got a good reason to do it, I think the workflow is definitely there. But it's pretty much API driven, yeah.
Awesome. Let's look through some of the other questions that came through in the chat, and you may some that stands out here.
So there's a cool one here about how do we aggregate documentation across microservices. What if all my dash pet endpoints are in one microservice, dash store, dash users are kind of segregated out, but yeah, we want to present just a single interface, right? We just want to have a pet store for people to consume. Some people will say, hey, let's just squish all of those different services into a single definition. But I think that kind of goes against the grain of what is really intended by this definition in the first place, right? It should be matched to the API itself. It shouldn't go beyond the scope of the API that it was generated from. So we need a way to present all of those together. We could, write some kind of script that takes all our paths and, flattens them into a single file. But my personal preference would be for us to expose something at the organization level here. So, maybe we have a project or something within the tool where we're saying, here's our pet store. It includes all of our different microservices underneath it. But we expose documentation at that pet store level. And we do have functionality within this tool where it can make a query against this, pull down a list of all of the services under a specific org, and then we could render those in a sidebar. It could be a list of our services. And then as we select each one of those, it kind of populates, the definition. It makes a call and populates that into the documentation portion in the front. So yeah, it's a great question. And, some people will go that route of just flattening things down, and really for simplicity's sake, where we can just have a single large document or mid-sized document with all of our functionality. I think that it's not a scalable solution. So having things segregated out as they are on the back end, not really explaining why they're kind of broken out like that, but having, our pet, our store, our users, kind of all of that kind of broken down, isn't that, difficult for a consumer to kind of read through and understand, they're making queries against these things. They probably all are, served through the same gateway, so they all have the same endpoint. It's really the paths that are different, but yeah, I just think for management's sake, especially if we're generating a lot of these things, if we're, making a lot of updates to our store components, but we never really touch pets or users, we would definitely want to have those kind of singled out so that we could version them individually, whether or not we, again, expose that to the consumer. So that's a pretty cool question, yeah.
Awesome. Another question that came in was, and I don't know how much detail we can go on this, but someone was just asking if you could maybe show how you would then go. So once you have the definition, maybe of the Swagger JSON file, how can you use that to then start to generate code for the API? Mm-hmm. Is that something you could quickly show?
Yeah. So again, we can do this through a plugin for Maven or for Gradle. Essentially, we tell it, here are the languages that I want to spit out, and it just goes and as part of the process does that. Just for the demo's sake, or to kind of expose this a little more easily, let's just go ahead and open up that. Here we go, API that we were working with. And on the right-hand side here, we have an export option. We could generate some server stubs. Seems a little redundant as we just pulled this definition from a server. So let's look at our client SDKs. Maybe we're doing something with, I don't know, Ruby. Go ahead, download that. And this is, again, going to give us a lightweight client that's scoped to the API we just designed. So that's pretty cool. It's going to change depending on the specification that we're initially feeding into it. Let's see if I can just pull this up here. And there's a pretty large list of what is and isn't supported. From a CodeGen side, if you check out Swagger.io and the CodeGen library, essentially lists, I think it's 40 different client SDKs, 20 different servers, or it might be the other way around. But yeah, here we now have this little kind of component that we could jump in, and if we wanted to, we could start to customize this and change this around to, again, work with the API. So I would have a starting point at this point that I could build on top of and start to really kind of flesh out and customize. So there's a lot of flexibility here when we do get into these code gen capabilities.
Awesome. We have time for a few more questions here. Let's quickly look through. Let's see. Yep, and a lot of questions we get are will be really specific, right, to different languages and things like that. And we said that we would kind of go through and show those or kind of recap some of those, give links to different annotation libraries that are out there. So we will do that as a follow-up activity for sure.
Yeah, everyone's interested in different languages. So I think it's best just to put them all into one place and let everybody kind of read through things in their own time. We'll try and pull together like tutorials and that type of thing.
Yeah.
We've got a ton of documentation, so not worried about that.
Absolutely, yeah. So someone asked, how do you aggregate documentation across microservices?
Yes.
I think this is a question that comes up a lot. I wonder if maybe you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, so kind of answered that one a couple of minutes ago, but for my money, they should still be exposed as separate kind of components. They should potentially live under a single documentation portal or platform or whatever it might be. But we should be treating those open API specifications as individual documents for the APIs that they're related to, as opposed to us trying to generate them all and squish them into a single one and then push that up to our documentation or to our gateways or to our portals, wherever it's going. I think keeping them in line with the service that they're tied to, especially when we're doing something like code first, is pretty important, and is a little more scalable than some of the other routes where we're trying to aggregate a ton of microservice documents into a single file. We just need a kind of a intelligent way to expose that to our end consumer, be it through something like Swagger Hub, a platform, or a single documentation portal with some links on the left-hand side, where like pet is service 1, store is service 2, user service 3. As a consumer, I wouldn't really understand. I wouldn't need to know that these are actually hosted as separate microservices. They probably all get routed through the same gateway. So all I really need to see is that each one of these has some different functionality, and yeah, I can kind of view the documentation for that. And we'll have more information when it comes to documentation, like collating things together. It's something we're going to kind of explore and get into a little bit more in the not too distant future. Swagger Hub is very driven by the kind of consumer thing or consumer piece of it. So it's definitely something that the product will start to pick up some slack for, as well as we'll be putting out some content around that as well, again, in the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. We got a question here just about differences around like the Swagger code gen and what you showed it within Swagger Hub. Mm-hmm. So it's important for people to kind of understand. I think that there's a relationship where the team, our team supports both the open source kind of Swagger tools as well as the Swagger Hub platform. Mm-hmm. What Swagger Hub really allows you to do is it brings together a lot of these tools into kind of one interface, right? So with a little bit more additional functionality that allows you to do more of your design, documentation, development. Any other major differences that really stand out for you, Nathan?
So for me, it's all about using these Swagger tools at scale, right? It's like we have an organization, we have a couple teams distributed. Maybe we've got team members in distributed locations. We could all be using Swagger or generating open API specifications, but there's a tipping point where it becomes more of a burden to manage those and to create, a process around those than we actually see a return on, the tooling that supports it. Swagger Hub is, again, really where we can start to step in and say, look, we'll take care of that workspace and that workflow, and we'll integrate all these different tools together and let you manage users and permissions and group people together and expose documentation. Yeah, we'll take care of that. You guys just generate the Swagger specs, generate the open API, and feed it into this kind of platform. So we do work really closely with the open source group. The eagle-eyed ones among you might notice that the available clients for the open source is pretty directly related to the ones that are in Swagger Hub. And this is something that's kind of a back and forth, right? It's like we facilitate some of development there. We pick up some of the stuff from the open source community. And there's a lot of kind of collaboration when it comes to things like, I think the CodeGen is probably the best example of that. But even with the editor or the Swagger UI piece, it's very much kind of a team effort when it comes to developing all these different components. And yeah, Swagger Hub is just a way for us to stitch all of these open source pieces together and layer in some workflow and some team management, some user kind of management components on top of that as well.
Awesome. So I think we're kind of getting right up against it here. I know a lot of the other questions that we have out there are still specific around some of the different languages that we support. As we said, we will be doing a follow-up piece to this, and we'll get out to everyone. And we'll also be sharing links to some of the different tools we showed. So we show links to Swagger Hub, as well as links to the different plugins that Nathan covered here. And if you do have, if you haven't had a chance to check out the poll we have set up here, if you do want to have a member of the team reach out to share some more information, schedule a demo, or just talk through the use case for your team, we definitely encourage you to do that as well. At this time, we're going to have to wrap up. I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day to join today's session. And Nathan, thank you so much for walking through today's training. Whether you're using a design-first approach or code-first approach, we try to develop tools that make it easy for you as either an individual or a team to really be successful. And hopefully you walk away today with some tactical things you can put into action. So thanks everyone who joined, and best of luck.
Yeah, thanks everybody.